Welcome back to Conversations on Communism. Elinor and I are joined today in our makeshift studio in the University of Westminster by Professor Kevin Morgan, historian of British communism from Manchester University, and Brian Blain, the former jazz correspondent for, the Daily Worker, Labour Monthly, and a number of other publications. Today we're going to be talking about communism and jazz.
Yeah, it's a great pleasure to talk to you again, Brian, because we do have those things in common, which is an interest in communism, an interest in jazz. And I wondered in your case, where they're going back to the 1950s, which was it came first? Was it as a communist or a left-wing person you became drawn to jazz, or was that already there when you got interested in politics?
Well, when I was at school, which would be in the mid to late 40s, when I was in my, 14, 15, 16, then I got, not just me, but me and a tight little group of, if you like, slightly odd people. We somehow got hooked up on jazz, which was of the really traditional kind. It was the sort of the old blues people, Hoodie Ledbetter and all those. And then, obviously, Louis Armstrong and Jelly Roll Morton and all that. That was normal. I can remember going on, like, we had lots of kind of hiking trips. We were members of a scout troop at the school we were at, which was Stretford Grammar School. And you'd go along whistling jazz things and sort of singing things. You'd spend hours listening to records. I was much more interested in the music than any political notions that went with it. In fact, at that age, I wasn't that aware of political notions. The only political notions I managed to pick up were from my parents, which were kind of classic conservatives, so then you rebel against that. There was the 45 general election, and I remember going to all the candidates' meetings, and one was a Communist Party member called Hugh Scanlon. I don't know if you know or remember that name. He became General Secretary of the Amalgamated Engineering Union, I think. And he, to me, as a young bloke, this is before I did my national service, he stood out as a candidate. It seemed like, well, bloody hell, why everybody vote for him? He can wipe the floor with the others, but it never actually worked that way. So the politics was simmering in the background, but they were not as important as the music.
And this is the early 50s, is it?
This was the late 40s, going into the 50s. Then I did my national service, which had been 1949 to 51, by which time jazz was on the cusp and was turning into bebop and modern jazz, which took you further away from the idea of grassroots, folkish people's music ideas, which were all clustered around traditional jazz, although it wasn't called that then, and which were actually much more acceptable to most people in the Communist Party that I began to meet even before I was a member.
What drew you into the Communist Party? Then that was entirely different things.
Yes, that was an entirely different thing. That was quite simple, really. I was trying to explain to Henry to a degree. I was a teacher at this time, a primary school teacher in Salford, and there were two or three things, but the most important thing is that there were two guys on the secondary school staff. I was a primary school teacher. We all had lunch together, and there was a classic right-wing Labour Catholic teacher, and then there was a real Tory guy. And there were these two blokes who'd been in the army, and they were both being Japanese prisoners of war. And they seemed to me to clean up on all the arguments. There seemed to be no contest. They just wiped the floor with everybody when you're sitting around the table having lunch. So that's what started to draw me towards the Communist Party. the next thing was I met my first wife, my girlfriend at the time, and her family were really staunch party members. I mean, they were an incredible family in their way. They lived on a council estate in Salford. The father had been in the 8th Army, and as I found out later, I mean, he'd gone up, obviously, the length of Italy, and he'd made friends, and obviously with the communist members who were very important in the Italy of that era. And it became like a family joke that he would drive off on his holidays, or be driven on his holidays, because he didn't drive, or didn't own a car rather, and go back on his own to Naples, I think, to hook up with the family. And I didn't realise the connection. I thought, well, why is he going? Why isn't he going to Scarborough somewhere like everybody else? But this must have been something to do with it. So I was surrounded by communists during the day at school, and in this new family that I'd encountered, the like of which working class intellectuals, I suppose, or autodidacts at least, of a kind of people I'd never met before. And obviously that becomes very important when you're quite young and you've only got a kind of vaguest of Tory backgrounds which you didn't agree with. One of the things about jazz was the fact that it was American. And there's the real link. The real link is that they didn't have this ludicrous notion of a royal family. Now, we don't need to go into all that. But it's, in other words, my republicanism was nothing to do with left-wing politics. It was just a feeling like you have about religion after a while. Well, this is just nonsense. Why do people believe this? It's just idiotic. It is actually neither left nor right, although it's assumed to be a left-wing position. But it's a position that drew you towards American culture, if you like. Jazz was part of American culture, but that's not all. That was a time when I was reading. It was a time when you're seeking out the really good American films, of which there were quite a lot in the early 50s, which are now cult films that show at the BFI, usually noir films, but not always. And if you didn't have a cultural background, there was a huge vacuum to be filled.
And what sort of books were you mentioned that?
Oh, well, obviously Steinbeck, and Sinclair Lewis, the one about Chicago Stockyards and so on. And we used to sit around in a coffee bar in Sale, which was the posh suburb that actually had a coffee bar, and talk about things like that. And right over the road was a ballroom, Sale Lido. And this is the other strange thing. Whilst there was, if you like, as I discovered from a distance, a very left-wing basis in the New Orleans revival because of its connection with folk music and the oppressed Negro, as they were always called then. Our actual consumption of live jazz was always in the ballroom. There were always people in the band who were good. And I discovered this later, but there was always a point in the evening when the band leader, if you like, would give the jazz people in the band their head. And so they'd be allowed to improvise and play kind of swing, come bebop or whatever on quick steps, which were the only things that would fit, or a slow foxtrot. And it was there, not jazz clubs at that time, that you imbibed live music. In fact, there was very little New Orleans revival jazz. And the friend I mentioned earlier, the trombone player who went on to the academy, he was a trombone player in Manchester's first ever real jazz band, and they were called the Delta Rhythm Kings. And I remember hearing that on a Sunday afternoon above a record shop just off Albert Square, called Hyman Addison's. And Hyman Addison's was the Mecca It specialised in selling jazz records, and it had this little room. And the Delta Rhythm King, that's the first time I ever heard any live jazz played. And as they always say, it really did just blow me away, and I became, I suppose in an unhealthy way, almost addicted to all this stuff. And that and the American cultural pattern generally blocked me off to things that I couldn't come to till much later, like classic English novels and so on.
You mentioned people like Jelly Roll Morton or Leadbelly.
Yeah.
And when I was doing the research into this a few years ago, the thing that struck me was that type of traditional jazz as a folk music, jazz as a music that had come up from below.
Yeah.
That was really so much identified with people that seemed usually to be on the left. Often there were communists that were actually promoting it or organising these little magazines. There was the Challenge Jazz Club that was, a product of the Young Communist League, basically. So that's what I'm finding, in a sense, researching from the centre. Are you sort of saying that actually sort of growing up, you're up there in Manchester, and actually you're not really aware of that aspect of it until later?
That's right. I only picked up any notion of it through the magazines that you started to buy, and then you could pick up a little vibe that made you think. When I read the chapter again in The Weapon in the Struggle book, there are certain names, and the main name was a guy called Albert McCarthy, and the ones that you read, they used to come up to Manchester. I was in this Manchester Rhythm Club, if that was the name of it. It may have been called something else. We met in a room in Deansgate. It just seems incredible now that people would come from London on the train just to play records and talk about them. And you kind of went along, and this was like seeing a star live performer. But he was just a record recitalist who had access to more records than you had, and he knew more about it than you did. And so there was a kind of weird mixture of sort of Good Time Charlie in the ballroom, and then this rather studious fingers, beard stroking, except we didn't have them, kind of way of listening to the music, listening to the real thing. It was something that you took very seriously.
But what you seem to be saying was that it wasn't such a niche music. If you and just the other people you knew at school knew about Jelly Roll Morton and Hoodie Ledbetter, this isn't like the sort of these aren't the big dance bands or big popular bands of the day. So it was a real was it a bit of a cult thing or a subculture?
It was very much a cult thing. I mean, what is interesting is that music, what was the real cult music, blossomed into a subgenre of pop music in the early 60s, which was actually, young people can't believe this, was actually massive. I mean, in other words, somebody like Humphrey Lyttelton, who's a name probably known to us all in here, actually had a hit record. That Bad Penny Blues, which I used to play. I used to do record recitals for students at the college in West London at Ealing. It was a course of British culture, and one evening was always for foreign students. Lots of them were Americans. And my job was to show how jazz survived the onslaught of rock and roll. I sort of lied a bit because I don't think it really did, but I did my best to make a case. But the thing is that the Bad Penny Blues track that I always used to play, they were always amazed that it was so authentic sounding and yet was in what came to be later known as the charts. So like this cult thing blossomed into that. Now the modern jazz, the bebop thing, didn't. It could only ride on the coattails of the more jazz-inclined big bands of the day. But at this stage, politics really didn't come into it for me.
And it's in more general terms, in terms of that sort of interface between music and politics, there was this sort of almost, it feels looking back like a civil war within the jazz world. You got the mouldy old figs on the one hand, and the people who like Tad Dameron and Good Bait and all the rest of it on the other. Are you saying that it was really the left sort of aspect was more the mouldy old figs than the modernists in musical terms, that saw that it was like a folk music? And
yes, I am, because when I came to live in London, it was the first time I'd met a significant number of Communist Party members. I was in a branch in Wood Green, and I find myself living in a bed-sitter next to a guy called Laurie Green and his wife Jean, and he was a really big jazz fan. I mean, a very serious communist. I think he went on being a civic community kind of activist for the rest of his days in a way that I haven't. I must confess to that. But his idea of modernism, the only bit he would accept was Billie Holiday and Lester Young, because you could not disentangle the two, and the young Ella Fitzgerald. There was a wonderful woman, communist teacher on the same staff as me, and a man, both of whom are dead now. And that was in a primary school in East London. And she couldn't understand how I could like this stuff, but she could understand the folkish, early traditional music. The same with the male, but he was deeply embedded in the folk scene. And I remember going to the dreaded Communist Party socials, which my heart used to sink even in those days. And one of the main guys, he died a few months ago, and that was a guy called Fred Dallas, who became Carl Dallas. Carl became quite famous. When it became the Rolling Stones era and all that, he switched completely to the whole rock thing and then fashion, and became a pot-smoking kind of evangelist, like repeal the marijuana. And he was actually a terrific guy. And then I noticed towards the end of his life, he'd swung back to left-wing politics again. But what I'm saying is, when you went to these socials, and my friend Nigel, who played the guitar and sang, and he was a lovely, lovely guy and a terrific teacher, this was their world. And they just thought that what I liked was Chinese music, almost. It was incomprehensible that you would actually be more excited by these sounds. Now, drawing a connection between those sounds and left politics was very hard to do until I read that light bulb moment of the key book of the time called Jazz, A People's Music by an American Marxist. You heard of him? Called Sidney Finkelstein. He was like a polymath. He was a scientist and a musician and a scholar. And his book unravelled the whole thing. He was the first real Marxist thinker. Marxist in the sense that I came to think was the reason why Marxism was important. A flexible way of looking at everything. And he went through the whole story of jazz, which I'd read by this time in other books probably, but he was able to relate the new people who were considered to be degenerate by your classical communists, and he could show that they weren't degenerate, that they were part of an amazing tradition. And very few people, in fact, I didn't know of another one. That book, by the way, the Finkelstein book, was published in 1948, which gives you some idea of how revolutionary it was. Nobody at that time would write anything like that. And the nearest thing that came to it was a few years later by the English Marxist Eric Hobsbawm, The Jazz Scene, which I guess must have come out late 50s maybe. I have a copy, but I couldn't find it on my shelf.
59, I think.
Yeah, it was Francis Newton, and we didn't know at that time that Francis Newton was in fact Eric Hobsbawm. And I used to read his pieces in the New Statesman when I would occasionally buy the New Statesman. But he was a different kind of Marxist. he was the one that most of us who have no profound musical knowledge drifted to. That is, analysing the social class and groups from which the music was actually played. Because it was later that you realised that even though it wasn't like popular music, it wasn't like Vera Lynn and so on, it clearly had its roots in, quote, ordinary people. That's not been the case for a long time now. So many of today's musicians, even rock musicians like young actors, are clearly from a kind of privileged background. But when you met these guys, and they were mostly guys, let's be honest, at the time, who could sort of roar through like bebop changes and play all that kind of music, they were invariably ordinary blokes. And so you had a class identity, even if you didn't realise it, with this stuff. It was not something other. It may have been other to your mum and dad, but it wasn't other in the sense that I got to know a lot of musicians at that time. And it was interesting that they weren't ordinary blokes. Obviously, they were exceptionally talented, but they weren't schooled talented. And they were playing the most complicated jazz there was at that time. Needless to say, the public hated it. It was quite funny. A musician friend of mine, like most of my friends who were dead, he used to say to me, the only bloke who ever made any money out of bebop was Cecil G. Do anybody remember who Cecil G was? Cecil G owned a big clothing store on Charing Cross Road. And they specialised in spear point collars and drape suits and everything else. All the fashions that the bebop musicians wore. Like the American musicians wore drape suits and all that, which is what we all aspired to wear ourselves.
One of the things that Hobsbawm says in that book that's quite interesting, in terms of what you're saying, is that actually it's not just the musicians, but also the fans were mostly young men. And actually in the 40s they seem to have been. And to be honest, when I started going to things in the 70s, it was mostly not always so young, but they were mostly men.
Yeah.
Why do you think that was?
Well, it's not a good thing, but the thing was that I think the music itself, the very sound of it is very macho. You can't escape that. The bulk of it is quite aggressive and macho. There have been exceptions to that rule. So that's the one thing. And the terminology, the thing about talking about players playing with lots of balls, for example, which is the normal way of describing a certain kind of really over-the-top hetero thing. It's a macho culture. And women were only seen as singers in dance bands. There were a few who became more than that, like Chris Barber's wife, Ottilie Patterson, and she was absolutely terrific, I think. And later, looking back, I thought, being able to function in this environment like that, it must have been a very lonely place. On our side of the fence, Cleo Lane was just an amazing pioneer. I mean, not only was she black, she sang in the most, at the time, considered to be the most advanced, technically difficult modern jazz band in England. I was very involved at the time, this is jumping forward to a completely different part of the story, with a band, an all-women's band called the Guest Stars. And I just thought they were absolutely terrific. I mean, they were all good players. They got terrific sort of, I don't know, just an amazing confidence, and they connected with audiences. And of course, they attracted a lot of women in audiences. And I still see remnants of that era today. One of the great survivors of this 30-year-ago era, or maybe a bit longer, she wasn't part of the Guest Stars, was a singer, a blues singer come rock singer called Carol Grimes. And Carol is still going. But when she does at our place, we're always packed. And we're always packed with a big proportion of middle-aged, getting on to be older women who got into the habit of going to listen to jazz or jazzy music because of this first group. They weren't the first. The first one was a woman called Kathy Stobart. I'm talking about the English world now. She was in Humphrey Littleton's band for a long time, and she was just a really terrific saxophone player. It's not a question of, for a woman. It was nothing to do with it. She was just tremendous. Now there's a whole host of them. That doesn't seem to have crossed over to young women followers in the way that earlier generation I've just mentioned did.
So you get this sort of, I don't know, you were almost like an addiction to jazz, you describe it. Then through, entirely separate from that, you become involved in the Communist Party at the time when one sense of it is that communism is still associated on the one hand with a degree of anti-Americanism, and on the other hand with a sort of idealisation of a Soviet culture, and often official Soviet culture, and officially promoting folk and concert musics. Did that cause tensions for you? How did you, as a communist activist, reconcile?
I mean, the thing is, I was, in some ways, I must have been quite a simple bloke. My wife kind of says, well, how could you possibly, and then there'll be a list of things, how could you possibly? Well, one of the things, I can remember going to a thing at the Free Trade Hall in Manchester, organised by I think it was the Anglo-Soviet Friendship Society, or it was one of those type organisations. And it was all folk dancing and accordions and balalaikas and everything else. And I can remember sitting there being actually bored shitless and thinking that this is what I had to do. I somehow had to acquire some empathy with this stuff because it was the Soviet comrades doing it. And so I was a rather conscientious little chap in a way, a bit of a goody-goody. So I didn't immediately say, oh God, this is boring. I just didn't want to admit I was bored. There was a tension. Well, funny enough, I was with some friends the other night, and they had two more friends, a real old-fashioned dinner party, the like of which we don't go to anymore. But this guy brought a name into the conversation. He was a musician himself, but a craftsman rather than a pro musician. And he reminded me of somebody that I'd once seen a documentary film about. I think his name was Eddie Rosner. Have you heard of that name?
I have, yeah.
He was a Polish guy who fled to the east at the time of the occupation. And apparently he was a fantastic trumpet player who could play just like Louis Armstrong. That's what people always say, isn't it? Oh, he's just like, But apparently he was a brilliant jazz trumpet player. And he became a commercial band leader. And he became a kind of superstar in the Soviet Union. He survived fleeing Poland, and not only survived in the Soviet Union, but became immensely popular.
He was approved by Stalin, that's the thing. And he could apparently play two trumpets at the same time. And he was second only to Louis Armstrong.
How did you find out about him?
It came up in a book called The Dancer Defects by a man called David Kaut. He leapt out at me. He was born in 1910, but sadly, and the story doesn't end well, in 1946 he was charged with espionage and sent to Kaluma Gulag in 47.